What, want to do a selfie?
Good morning, people. I feel like Britney Spears with this thing. Quite dancing. So good morning, welcome to the panel. With me are two superstars in mobile gaming. We have Yat from Outblaze and Mr. Jeff. Jeff is actually the world's third-ranked Clash Royale player. So if you want tips later, bug him. So gentlemen, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Start with me. So very briefly, my name is Yat. I started the company Outblaze 18 years ago. We are not actually just in mobile gaming, but we have 3 companies in mobile game space. So I guess that's why I'm sitting here in this panel. And we've been doing mobile games since 2011.
I'm Jeff. So I started in the game industry 17 years ago. I started a company called iDreamSky in Shenzhen, roughly around 6 years ago. And we focus in mobile game publishing. We publish games like Fruit Ninja, Temple Run, Subway Surfer. And we're currently still listed in NASDAQ. And yes, I'm also advisor for Hong Kong esports.
Fantastic. So talk to me about mobile gaming right now. Where are we? What point are we at? What are some of the trends that are driving the market forward?
All right, so from a global standpoint, it's a mature market at this point. Mobile phone, smartphone distribution is about now only 10%. Right, so basically, if you think about growth, it's only 10%. Previously, we were talking about 30 or 40, 50% growth, which means the game has changed. It's a mature market. So before, game companies or smartphone players would grow just because the market would grow. And now, when you talk about a place where you have incumbents, where you have a mature market strategy, where can you see that new growth segment? Gaming is seeing the same area as well. So we're at about 1.2 billion smartphones around the world. Android is clearly leading, but what's also clearly becoming a race to the bottom. Right, so before, people were buying more and more expensive phones, but most of the phones that are being sold now, in terms of broad range, are like the Huawei and the Lenovo's around the world, not just in China, basically because of cost advantages. So the new user adoption comes from growth markets, like Brazil or maybe India and some parts of China. But other markets are slowing down, and we're seeing a trend in kids that is growing at this point.
Yep. So in China, I think it's like 2 years behind the global scene, but we're also seeing similar situations where, right now in China, there's roughly around 534 million mobile gamer, and last year, 2015, I believe, is 140 billion mobile gaming revenue that was generated in China. It's very similar where the iOS growth is pretty much there already, and on the Android side, the high-end device players are pretty much staying on the S6, S7. Where we see a lot of growth in China is on the really third-tier cities, where there's still a lot of gamers that behaves playing casual games, very bandwidth mindful. We're also seeing a lot of growth in the kids sectors. However, I think we're still on a mid-digit, double-digit growth in China this year. The past couple of years, we were looking at like 100, 200, 300% growth. iDreamSky specifically, we grow like 600% in 2013, 2014. So I think this year we're looking at like roughly around 30 to 40% growth of the total revenue.
So a big thing for developers, for advertisers, for basically anyone in the mobile space is identifying your market. So a question I often get asked is, who is the mobile gamer? What's he like? How's he different from the console gamer? So I think it'd be interesting for us to know who you guys think the mobile gamer is.
I think that question is becoming much more blurred. There was definitely a clear sort of defining difference between a console gamer, a so-called real gamer, and a casual smartphone gamer 4 or 5 years ago. But that blur has definitely changed, partially because many of the hardcore, or even the ones who are playing now on Steam, those industries are growing because of the smartphone. People were introduced to smartphone gaming because they never knew that this was an interesting audience for them. That's an interesting sort of content they could play, but then they wanted the hardcore, mid-core experience, and they couldn't really fully get it on the smartphone at the time. So if you look at console sales, it's actually it's higher than ever before. Even though everyone predicted the death of the console, the opposite happened because the smartphone actually converted users into becoming hardcore users.
Well, China have like 1.1, 1.2 billion people, and there's 500 million players. That's half of China, so that's everyone, right? That's anyone could be a mobile gamer. In a very classic case of our game Fruit Ninja, we have kids that is calling the customer service line when they're like 3-year-old, like they're just blurring, right? And we have customer that calls and we find out that he's like an 80-year-old grandpa, right? So the spectrum is truly wide. If you ask me what's a mobile gamer, I think the better question is like, what type of games will give you what type of gamers? But anyone, I believe here, have somehow played mobile gaming. If we turn back the clock 10 years ago, maybe only half of the crowd, or maybe 1/3 of the crowd have played games.
Okay, so we're here to talk about VR and AR specifically. So right now we have the smartphone games, it's all this tapping the screen. So what do you think technologies from VR and AR could bring to mobile gamers?
So I think there's a couple of things going on in the VR space. One of them is industry desperation on one hand, and then the other one is potential. But the potential really is something that I think is something that will sort of happen in due time. And when I talk about industry desperation, it's because what I mentioned earlier about the market saturation and the maturity. So where's the next growth going to come from, right? If you only see 10% rise in smartphone sales, if every person already has a actual is already playing a smartphone game, what new experiences can I give him? Oh, VR. Can the VR do what it did for Nintendo with the Wii, for instance, right? Is it possible? So actually leading the charge in investments are all the gaming companies because they're basically hoping for that next growth vector. Because they've reached a certain growth area, how can you double your revenue growth? It's kind of hard, right? So I think that's why the industry is there. But what you see with all of these cycles is that because all the money's coming in, something will happen, right? And it probably will take some time for it to evolve. Over our guess is 2 or 3 years. Right?
Yeah, I have very similar view of it. Actually, if you look at when I get into like VR conferences, when I talk to investors and hear what they feel about VR, it actually feels a lot like WAP, the WAP days, right? Oh, this is the next big thing. This is going to change the world. And did WAP change the world? Not really, but did WAP lead to the change of world? Yes, mobile internet, right? And I think a lot of it feels like that right now, where there's a lot of building blocks that is still there. A lot of developers going into VR not knowing what VR really means, right? I think VR is not going to take off as quick as mobile, because if you think about mobile is like, a big developer that is like 20 people can break into 5 teams, right? But actually, and that has happened in the past 10 years. So a lot of these bigger size developer, 20 to 50 size developer, have break into smaller teams. Now these smaller teams decide to jump into VR right away, but actually they will actually need to convert back into a 20 people team, right? Because there's so much technical know-how that we don't know what we're going into, right? Just like when we first get into 3D gaming, right? 3D model building, right? Like we find out we need to do LODs, we need to do like motion blur, we need to do like all these texture mappings. VR is a whole new space, because now for the past 20 years of game development, we have been interacting on a flat screen. It's literally you're looking at a flat screen, right? And VR is not a flat screen. It's a 360 screen that you can walk around. So even the control is different, right? In the past 20 years, we're just changing the control mechanism, right? From a joystick to a joypad to a touch screen to mouse and keyboard. But fundamentally, you're still looking at a flat screen. This time we're changing control. We're changing the view. So there's lots of things that we need to learn. So I think in the next 2-3 years, I think it's really a lot of building blocks.
The space is also very fragmented, right? So what's happening is that you don't have one clear leader at the moment, which is both opportunity but also risk. You say, which platform are you going to support? In some ways, it does mimic very much the original console days. Would you support Sega? Would you support Nintendo? Do you support Microsoft? Right? Which way do you go?
So how long do you think it'll take us to reach parity, where we're going to say, okay, this is our VR standard, this is what developers are going to use, this is what hardware manufacturers are going to use?
Okay, so I mean, there's multiple views on this. I think the first one, mass adoption on the hardware, is going to be really, really important. It's going to be very difficult for someone to sort of just do. I mean, we have VR beginnings of VR social networks, so they take the phone and they kind of go, oh, let's see, this is kind of interesting, but it's still in the gimmicky kind of stage. For it to actually deliver real value, and you want to put it on a headset, that headset needs to come down in price, and you need to agree on a steady form factor. Right now, you've got Oculus. and then you've got basically a Valve, right, with sort of fighting it out, and then you've got Sony as well, right? So who do you bet on, right? For a developer, it's very expensive to reach out with that. So there's got to be a lot of investment happening in the space.
Yeah, and it's very, very different development pipelines. You know, whether you're doing a mobile VR game or you're doing the Oculus or the Vive. Oculus and Vive is almost similar, but Morpheus is a whole new monster, right? And then on top of that, in China alone, you know, you have all these like VR makers, right? There's at least like, I was just in a VR conference, and there's at least like 6 different headsets that is being developed in China with different tech and different comps that they're working on, right? Some of them are comping themselves with Oculus, some of them are comping themselves with the Samsung VR, some of them is comping themselves with Morpheus, right? So, you know, I think, you know, even if the non-China VR standard is established, is that same standard going to be established in China? If we think Oculus is going to be a standard, you know, it's not going to China. If we think Morpheus is going to be a standard, it's not going to China, right? And that means developer probably, when they go into China, they really develop the whole thing again.
Right. So I think what you'll see, similar to where mobile games was as an example as an industry 5 or 6 years ago, is you have all of these different standards, or in this case, different SDKs, and then you'll find someone who will create a middleware that will connect them all, and then we'll use that, and then basically it's not necessary anymore because there's a clear winner, right? So you'll go through that evolution, that cycle, and as long as people are investing in that space, it will be interesting. I think the worst thing that could happen to VR is when people have short-term expectations. If they think, oh, you know what, I'm going to invest all this money now, and I'm expecting something that'll impact my balance sheet or P&L in the next 12 months, oh, it's not working, I pull out, then we'll have a VR winter. And I think that's a problem. So people need to have a long-term expectation about it.
Okay, so I mean, we've had Samsung's Oculus for a couple of months. Everyone's kind of doing something. So can you give me a good example of a game that's doing it right? Like, give me a good example of good VR gaming content.
So one of the games that I tried was classic zombie shoot-up game. It was on the HTC Vive. That was pretty cool. And the interesting thing about that experience is that first when I went in, because the resolution isn't high enough yet, so I didn't feel like I was totally in there. And because I was used to playing first-person shooters, it was fairly easy. But within 15 minutes, my perception started to change, which is why I think a lot of people feel were the potential is of VR. My perception changed because suddenly it became a kind of reality. But it took me 10 to 15 minutes. Because if you think about the psychology of our brain, we trick ourselves into thinking, this is where it is. People look at Minecraft and they say, this is a really ugly game. Why would you play it? But spend enough time in there and it becomes your reality as well. And that's what's happening with VR, but in a much more immersive area. So by about 20 minutes in, my heart was pumping. Right? And I started feeling a kind of excitement that would take me longer, partially because I'm expecting it. Right? If you're playing first-person shooters, you are already attuned to it. VR gives you a fresh experience. So that's exciting.
A game that I really like is Land's End. So it's not as exciting as FPS goes, but it's a great mobile experience. Each game session is roughly around anywhere from 3 minutes to 5 minutes. I don't need any complicated controls. It's just tilting my head, but it gives me that immersive experience, right? It brings me to another world, a world that is really beautifully crafted, like Monument Valley, right? And it plays smart with camera angles, and it doesn't give me the dizziness. Even if it's flying through space, you're going through portals, and you're doing all kinds of funny things. And I think this is where Land's End is a game where I really feel that is one of the potential of VR is it brings you to this immersive experience that you cannot achieve with a flat screen, because on a flat screen you're still connected to the world, right? With VR, you're blocking the world away from you, and you're going into a new world, right? And what kind of world can you really deliver? I can see games like that, or immersive video content or experience that is like 5 to 15 minute session where people can go for a coffee break, a lunch break. They just want to relax, and sit down. Go to Maldives or go to like space or go underwater, for 15 minutes and, juice up themselves and go back to work life.
Sure. So we have a bunch of good startups here. We have, this is a startup conference. So what advice would you folks have for startups that are really looking to, not say cash in, but get into this new VR phenomenon in gaming?
I mean, there's a bunch, but the first thing I would say is have a very long view, right? Because this is going to be sort of, have a long view and be ready to sort of struggle in this space, as it was in every nascent industry, right? The other thing, of course, is because this is a long-term play, partnering up with the kind of people, not just for funding, but also for actual access to early developer support is really important. This is an early access game. This is about right now, in this stage, it's about being first at something, right? Because it's so early. So how are you first? Building a relationship with the right partner, take a bet, move into that space, and then go all in. Because as a startup, that's all you can do, right? Anyway.
Couple things. One, if you can still raise money, raise.
Sure.
Because I foresee, in the next 12 to 18 months, we're going, I won't say it's a winter, but at least a lot of the fund will be depleted on VR, and the investor will want to wait and see, and it will be hard to raise by then, just like the mobile winter, right? The second thing is, I think don't expect this growth, like Yat said, don't expect this growth to be mobile, right? Don't expect yourself to make a game, and if that game is the game, you're going to be rich, set off for life, right? That's how mobile was, right? Like if you make Angry Bird, if you make Flight Control, if you made the Fruit Ninja, you're set for life, done. I don't even think the next 12 to 18 months, if someone made a game that is that phenomenal, it will be a set for life type of game. And I would say patent your stuff. Patent your technology. Because I think a lot of the technology in VR will carry away into the longer sprint into VR and even possibly AR, right? And who knows?
Right.
In the early days in the internet, someone patent technology of like rotating banners.
Yeah.
I think the one thing about patenting, that it's good to patent, but then you need to patent many things.
Yes.
Because there are always ways to get around the patent. So it's typically good for defensive, not really for offensive purposes. Yeah. So therefore, you need to look at the sort of a general purpose patent if you can, and try to look at as many. For that, you also need funding, right? Yeah. But it's a good sort of midterm, long-term sort of strategy.
So as we're approaching the end of this session, for VR, gaming has been something of a harbinger. It's bringing it forward. So beyond gaming, what do you see as some of the immediate uses for VR? Like I know yourself, you're doing a lot with education,
kids,
stuff
yes.
with messaging. So
I mean, for us, I think education and learning is where I think VR will have a greater impact in the short term. Because it has a sort of a B2B element. And if you think about what just something like 2D, like YouTube has done for music learning or for basically general education, right? It's amazing already. Now imagine doing that with VR and actually experiencing that, right? If you think about how many of the tools that we're using with the technology, it's about reducing the friction of the input. And VR is one method of reducing the friction of the input because you're suddenly using many more of your senses than just a TV screen. And I think education is one of the things that will have that impact in the next, sort of in the more of the short and midterm than gaming.
I'll have more general time. I think video is going to be a big thing, right? Like I'm seeing project where people relive, certain landmark experience in movies or experience that normally you will not go to. And recently we saw that this one experience, which is you're like climbing on a plank on a skyscraper, right? It's not really video, but it's like a 360-degree video that you have some sort of interaction. I think that is going, and that's easy to approach, right? Anyone can just put on a VR headset. You don't need to, teach him how to navigate. He just goes through that world. So I think video is one space that I'm immersive, experienced videos. That's something that I think is good.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, audience.
Selfies.
Are we going to selfie?
Yeah. All right.
All right.